I ran across a story told by a Catholic priest named Father Vincent Dwyer. And the story he shared had to do with a very picturesque town in Italy. And the town had right at its very center this cathedral. It was old. It had been built back in the 14th century. It was truly an awesome structure, and the beauty of that church had inspired countless numbers of people for literally hundreds of years. In many ways, that cathedral became a monument to faith. Tourists could visit it, marvel at the art there and the treasures inside. And you would think that such a beautiful church would be filled with people every Sunday, right? You would think that people who lived in that town would want to be part of this magnificent structure. But the truth is that when a new priest was assigned there and arrived in town, what he was faced with was an empty building. Because very few people in that village actually ever worshipped in that grand old cathedral. Oh yeah, the church was an artistic gem. It was an architectural masterpiece, but spiritually, it was only a museum. So the new priest decided to make a drastic change. He decided to take that congregation and move it and build a small, simple cinder block church just a short distance from that beautiful old cathedral. Now, to be quite honest, the only word to describe the new church apparently was the word ugly. Certainly it was no artistic match for the great cathedral. It was square and squat, 1 story high, colorless, and yet on Sunday mornings it was packed with people for Mass. Old people, young people, families, all kinds of people. The new church quickly became a very thriving and worshiping community, and it had this lively, contagious faith to it. Why? Why? Well, the new pastor who was there as the priest offered this explanation. He said that in that beautiful, historic, ancient cathedral, although it was gorgeous, it wasn't really theirs. It belonged entirely to another era, to other people. It belonged completely to a different time. That story, I think, illustrates a very important truth for us today, and that is, for faith to make any real difference in your life and in my life, it has to be our own faith. Faith's not something we can borrow from the neighbors. It's not something we can borrow from our families or from our fellow church members in the pews or from anybody else for that matter. We don't automatically inherit our faith either. It doesn't come as part of our DNA gene pool from previous generations. It doesn't rub off from people we admire. It doesn't work that way. Now, today being Mother's Day, we need to say we can never underestimate the importance of the role of parents in guiding children in the ways of faith. Role modeling by parents has a huge effect on children. And if we had wise parents, or if we are wise parents, then we understand how critical it is to set a positive environment for the growth of faith in children. Because faith needs to be encouraged, it needs to be watered and nourished. I hope we understand just how important it is to provide a positive image for the younger generations. They're just beginning their own journey of faith. But faith itself, that's an element that in each one of us, in our own good time, we have to claim for ourselves if it's ever going to make any real difference in our lives. Now, in our scripture reading this morning, the Apostle Paul is off on what we think was his second missionary journey, and he stopped in the very historic city of Athens, Greece. Now, even then, Athens was still the center in many ways of Western civilization. Yeah, Rome may have been the capital of the empire. It may have been the headquarters for the Caesars, but it was still Athens that the great philosophers called home. It was Athens that still was seen as the intellectual hub for the rest of the world. Now, as Paul, he's walking around the city streets, and he's doing what you and I would probably do. He's kind of sightseeing. And he notices the great number of statues there, statues that had been built in honor of the various Greek gods and goddesses. And the occasion of our reading from the book of Acts is when Paul then goes up to the Areopagus, this huge amphitheater up on Mars Hill. And that's where the Athenians came every day to debate different philosophies, to exchange different thoughts, to be mentally challenged by new ideas. So we have this rather dramatic scene. We've got Paul, a stranger in a strange land, and he's standing in the very place where the great Greek philosophers had once stood. And he's engaging his listeners with good old Christian evangelism. And in that evangelism, there's something for us too, for you and me, whether we happen to be a pastor or a parishioner or a parent today. Paul begins by telling the crowd how much he has enjoyed walking through their city. He compliments them. And he says, hey, I've noticed how religious you folks are. Now you notice that Paul never condemns them, never criticizes them for their pagan polytheistic ways. I think it's important we see that he didn't insult them or tell them how wrong they were, never called them bad people. Now, he was smarter than that. And he knew from experience that positives are much stronger than negatives, that praise goes a lot further than blame. And in that approach, we see one of the fundamental principles of good evangelism. We see one of the basic lessons in how to do faith sharing. And it's also a very fundamental principle of parenting, too. You always start with people where they are. You always start with kids where they are. When you begin where they are, you've got a much greater chance of having them hear your message. And you've got a much greater chance of affecting a change in the way they think. Boy came home from elementary school one day and he said to his mom, hey, I think I'd make a pretty good evangelist when I grow up. Well, Mom was completely taken off guard and she said, why? And he said, well, hey, do you remember that kid named Herbie that sat right behind me in class? Well, today I convinced him that my religion was better than his. And Mom said, oh my, how in the world did you do that? And the kid said, oh, it was easy. I just kept hitting him in the head with my Bible until he agreed that I was right. The success of Paul's evangelizing was in his complimenting, not his condemning, the Athenians. And that's good advice for pastors and for parishioners. Begin where people are. And it's great advice for parents. Begin always where your kids are. Now, as we know, the Greeks, they believed in many gods. Now, they had a different god or goddess for just about every occasion. And just in case they missed one, they had also built this altar with the inscription saying, to the unknown God. Talk about hedging your bets and covering the bases. But behind this theological insurance policy, they had set up something of a true yearning for God. And it was that yearning that Paul saw. And then he jumped on it. And he says in a very non-threatening way, in a very non-coercive way, you know what? I'd like to tell you about this unknown God. And with that rather ingenious approach, we see Christian evangelism at its really best. And we see faith sharing at something of its apex. Sometime back, there was a pretty good ad on TV. Maybe you'll remember this. It was brought out by the Mercedes-Benz company. And it talked about all the safety features that they had carefully built into their cars, especially one crash-absorbing mechanism. And they also readily admitted that many of these same safety features could be found on other cars too. But they went on to say that Mercedes was the first to put them in every car. Because as the advertisement said, there are some things that are just too important not to share. That's a great line. When you and I talk about our faith, talk about our God, talk about our church, with our friends, with our neighbors, with our colleagues, and especially when we talk about these things with our kids, that needs to be our motivation too. This is just too good not to share. Paul knew all about the tragedy of a faith that was unfulfilling. We remember before his conversion to Christianity, he had broken himself against the unrelenting and impossible expectations of thousands of those minute religious laws of Judaism that were totally impossible for any mortal to keep. So he knew from personal experience that he really had found something infinitely better, something that really could be life-transforming, a faith that really was satisfying. And having found that, he wanted to share it. So here he stands among those intelligent, educated Greeks, and he sees this opportunity to tell people about the one true God who created the heavens and the earth. For all of those early Christian men and women, sharing their faith was the most natural thing in the world. For many of us, oddly, we act like it's the hardest, but it isn't. It doesn't have to be. Let me give you one great example here at the end. There's a woman called Dorothy, and she tells the story on herself. There was one afternoon she was listening to one of those Christian radio stations as she and her carload of kids drove down to the supermarket. Now on the radio, somebody on the station was talking about plain old, everyday, common kindness. And Dorothy thought to herself, I wonder how that could possibly apply to me while I'm driving to the store with my kids. Well, she pulled into the parking lot, and as she did so, she noticed what looked like the last empty parking space, but as she headed toward it, sure enough, another car coming from the opposite direction also arrived at the same space at the very same time. Dorothy stopped, and she graciously waved the other woman in as she slowly backed away and looked for another spot, which she finally found, but it was way off in the very last row of that huge lot. So now she gathers up her kids and she starts toward the entrance, and she notices that the other woman driver had waited for her. And as she approaches, the woman says, I just cannot believe what you did. And I have to tell you that. Anybody else would have pulled in right in front of me and then made me back away. Well, that started a conversation. And Dorothy kind of smiled and said, well, guess what I was just listening to on the radio? And it got me thinking about everyday little acts of kindness and how our Christian life often gets lived out in these little, seemingly simple and insignificant ways. And one thing led to another, and Dorothy discovered this woman had just moved into the area. And she didn't know anybody. Still trying to find her way around. And she was also looking for a church. So to make a long story short, within 6 months, these two strangers had become really close friends. And Dorothy's church, it had a new member. Now, that's a great story. But you know what? The story's not about Christian broadcasting. And the story's not about how we make friends. And the story's not even really about Dorothy either. The story is about those kids in Dorothy's car. It's about what they saw their mother do that day at the store. It's about parental role modeling when it comes to living out our Christian faith in 100 simple acts of kindness in very normal human relationships, in treating other people as we would like to be treated ourselves, with respect and dignity and concern. God is not far from each of us. Those are Paul's words. God is not far from each of us. And neither are the opportunities for us to serve that God every day and to demonstrate to others, especially to the kids in our lives and the children around us, to demonstrate to them what God expects of us and how we are to live, whether it's in the Areopagus on Mars Hill or in the parking lot down at the local supermarket. God bless you, and amen for this day.